Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, thanks very much for coming, all of you, because what a busy day we've got today and what a busy evening we've got. So 40 minutes of telling you about the Channel Dash. Right, the background to this was that if you came to my submarine talk about the U-boats, you'll know that initially Adolf Hitler was very keen to try and rival the Royal Navy in terms of the size and complexity of his surface fleet, and he didn't really believe that submarines were either a chivalrous form of warfare or one that would be particularly effective. So he was adamant that he should have a large surface fleet of ships. But they were constrained initially, the German nation was constrained by a 1920 treaty which limited the size and the number of capital ships they were allowed to have. Wouldn't allow them to have submarines at all, as I told you the other day, but it limited the number of capital ships. That meant that his plan to have a navy that could be comparable to the Royal Navy was partly by capturing other people's navies, like the French Navy, allying himself with Italy, a great maritime nation with some wonderful capital ships, and also building sufficient numbers himself. And the plan was to build them all and be ready for war by 1945. So all the planning that the Germans did was based on a war that would take place 4 years and a few months after Hitler actually went to war. So they ended up with a relatively small number of capital ships, but extremely effective ones. And they sent them out before war was even started with Poland. The ships were at sea before Poland was invaded on the 1st of September 1939. Ships like the Graf Spee, as I told you about in my previous talk, were down in the South Atlantic, and ships like the Deutschland were in the North Atlantic. And we all know what happened to the Graf Spee. Operation Berlin went on between the 22nd of January and the 22nd of March 1941. And that was an operation with two of the Scharnhorst-class ships, the Scharnhorst herself and the Gneisenau. And they sailed all over the place in the North Atlantic, but they were ordered explicitly not to engage Royal Navy or enemy capital ships, because the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy High Command, knew that they didn't have enough ships to spare to actually take on the Royal Navy. So they sped around the ocean, getting merchant ships, trying to sink merchant ships to blockade Great Britain for exactly the same reason that the U-boats did that I talked about the other day. And they sailed 18,000 miles in 60 days, and it was considered a successful commerce raid, and they destroyed or captured only 22 ships. So the expenditure in oil, particularly, which of course for Germany was a scarce resource, no natural oil resources in Germany, very good at making synthetic oil, but no natural resources, that expended on that. So Hitler ordered those ships to Brest to refit, rearm, replenish, and retrain. And then we have Operation Rheinbogen, Operation Rhine. 18th of May to the 27th of 1941, and this was the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen. And of course, this is the famous Sink the Bismarck episode in the Battle of the Denmark Straits, where the Bismarck, first of all, was extremely effective in the sense that when it did get engaged by Royal Naval capital ships, somebody asked me a question earlier, a gentleman in the front, about the shooting ability of the German Kriegsmarine. Right from the Battle of Jutland in the First World War, the German Navy excelled at shooting long-range guns. And in the 1940 Norwegian campaign, the Scharnhorst shot one of our aircraft carriers, HMS Glorious, and sunk her from 25,000 yards. The longest shot in history of a standard ordinary weapon, sinking a ship. In the Battle of the Denmark Strait, the Bismarck did the same thing at 23,000 yards on HMS Hood. And in 3 shots, hit the magazine, and she went down, and there were only 3 survivors. A terrible, terrible thing, which hit the British public very hard, because there were photographs of the ship blowing up The Bismarck then became a hated piece of kit by the Brits because of what it had done. So there was an order that went out to find and sink the Bismarck at all costs. The captain of the Bismarck, or the commodore, in fact, of the squadron, the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen, ordered the Prinz Eugen to go home to Brest, and he headed off. He had got shot once, the Bismarck, and he was leaking fuel. So he was desperate to get back to Brest, but he was leaving an oil slick behind him. So he was tracked by the Royal Navy, eventually sighted by a coastal command of the Royal Air Force, and the Bismarck was attacked by Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers, and she was eventually sunk. So the Prinz Eugen, the Gneisenau, and the Scharnhorst are now in Brest. They've been sent there to refit. They're rather worse for wear. They've had a couple of cruises where they've been fighting. They need to repaint, a refit. They've had a lot of their specialist crews, particularly engineering staff, taken off them and sent to other theatres of war. And Brest itself, whilst it's a very good port for the Germans, it's close to the Atlantic, and they thought that they could use it in order to attack and blockade our convoys and to blockade our country, blockade the UK. Had a nice sheltered harbour, had maintenance and repair depots, a rather reluctant workforce. The French used to sabotage the ships as much as they possibly could, but it was excellent to provide access to the convoy routes. But it was a very, very vulnerable target for our bomber command and coastal command, our aircraft. So we would bomb it almost every day. Whenever the weather was good enough to see through the cloud or between the clouds and see the ships, we would send out a mission, a reconnaissance mission initially. We would find out where the ships were lying, find out exactly what the conditions were weather-wise, send out a team. So they were constantly under barrage. So an order came down from the highest level, Hitler himself, saying, bring the ships back to Germany, where we can protect them properly, and then they can operate north. As we go into the Soviet Union, they can start to do what they were supposed to do in the Channel and have really failed, and we'll let the submarines do that. Bring them north, and we'll let them attack the Arctic convoys that the Allies will start to supply our new enemy, the Russians. So the order was to go and bring those ships back to Germany. Now, the Admiralty in Berlin wanted them to go round the British Isles, back down the Denmark Straits and into northern Germany via the North Sea from the north. But Hitler demanded that they come right past the Brits, sail straight through the English Channel, which is why the subject of my talk is the Channel Dash, because that's exactly what they did. They called it Operation Cerberus. Tell you a little bit, just as diversion, about the Germans' use of code names. They loved, as all military organizations do, they like to put code names into what they're going to do. Operation Desert Storm, Operation Desert Shield. You know how it goes? We do that. Everybody does it. Cerberus is all right, because Cerberus doesn't tell you much about what they're going to do, because Cerberus was a Greek mythological dog with more than one head who guarded the gates of Hades. So, okay, you're not going to work out what they're going to do from that. But the Germans used to use things for some of their equipment. They had a wonderful radar set that could see quite a long way, so they called it Freya. Freya is the Nordic goddess of great beauty with one all-seeing eye, and they named their radar after her. Wasn't long before our intelligence people heard the name on the wires and decoded it and said, I wonder what that is. Well, some Greek or classical Nordic philosopher, historian said, well, actually, you can see for 1,000 miles. They had a tactic they used for night fighters to protect Germany. They used a box system. They quadranted the ground with squares, and then one night fighter would operate in one specific square. They called it a Himmelbett, which in literal translation in German is a sky bed or a four-poster bed. So it didn't take us long to work out what that meant every time it came over the radio. We, on the other hand, use all sorts of strange code names. we called one of our flares that was dropped from aircraft Parramatta, because the guy that was working on it at the time came from Sydney, Australia, with the Parramatta River going through the back. We called another one of our devices Wanganui, which was the place that the treaty with the Maoris was made in New Zealand, because the guy doing it came from New Zealand. So code words like CERBERUS and the channel dash sometimes can actually tell you what your opponent intends to do. But in this case, it didn't. The objective was to move these ships from France to Germany under the noses of the British and past the Royal Navy. The last time anybody had attempted that had been the Spanish Armada. Yep. So we thought they might try it, but even so, because Hitler had ordered them to do it this way, even against the advice of his admirals, it meant that resources were thrown into the operation. And I have to say that a piece of organisation it really was. They took the head of the Luftwaffe fighters, a chap called Adolf Galland. They brought him all the way down to Brest. He went on board the Scharnhorst, and he was told, you must provide constant aerial protection for us throughout the whole sailing from Brest all the way up to Hamburg. You must provide constant protection, because we don't want to have a Battle of Britain again. We don't want to get defeated by the Royal Air Force. Ships were sent down. Radar jamming devices were invented and brought down to jam the British radar. And all this was done weeks and weeks and weeks before. And slowly the prevention measures, the flying of aeroplanes, the turning on of radar, the jamming of radio, was slowly turned up in order that the Allies, the Brits at that time, didn't get suspicious. And that's exactly the sort of thing that we did before D-Day. And this has a lot of relationships with the D-Day, because the mistakes that were made were learnt before D-Day, and the preparations that were made before D-Day were made for this as well. So that was the idea. With these three capital ships would steam out of Brest, sail up through the English Channel, and they'd end up in Germany all safe and well. Now, I'm showing you the times and the dates at the top of the slides that relate to actual times when things happened. I'm using a digital clock which didn't exist in 1942. I'm using a digital clock because if I was using a 24-hour clock, it would look terribly confusing on the screen. So bear with me as a historian using something that wasn't invented at the time, but it makes it clearer for me to explain what was happening. We expected them to break out of Brest during the daytime, so they passed through the Straits of Dover at dark. That's what we had planned for, and if they did it, we expected them to do that. We expected them to move out of Brest, and we were constantly looking at them. So we sent Royal Air Force Lockheed Hudsons, the aircraft that you can see at the top there, and we had submarines permanently based off Brest, keeping an eye on what was going on and what was moving. And we raided it, as I said, on a regular basis. Well, at 11:45 on the 11th of December 1942, they started to move these ships. At precisely that moment, the aircraft, they called them stopper aircraft. The stopper aircraft that was coming out to exchange places with the aircraft that was going home, having finished its patrol, got halfway to the patrol line and its air-to-surface radar stopped working. So one aircraft was going home without any fuel, and the other aircraft was coming out with radar that wasn't working, so he turned back as well. So at precisely this time, there were no aircraft. There was also an air raid going on, and because there was an air raid going on, HMS Sea Lion, who was supposed to be watching the port, the captain decided, well, they're not going to be doing anything during an air raid. So at 11:45 on the 11th of December 1942, he sailed off out into the Atlantic and came up to the surface to charge his batteries, having sat outside Brest all day. So no warning was given that they had departed. We had an agent in Brest with a radio. Every time he tried to get through, it was being jammed. So they got out undetected. Hitler had said of them, the Brest group are like a patient suffering from cancer who's doomed unless he submits to an operation. The passage up the channel will be just such an operation. It has to be attempted. So now they're off. soon as we set sail, we guessed there was something wrong. There was something going on. We kept wanting to check the direction, but that was not possible, as the compasses were switched off. We kept looking at each other. There was something wrong. Nobody said a word. We couldn't find anything out. Even the first artillery officer who was taking the watch told us nothing. It was only later, when it was announced that we were heading home, when we were out of range, that the compasses were switched on again. When I looked at the compass, I saw that we were steaming first west, and we kept looking at the compass, then to see it was in which direction we were heading home. Then we went north, and a few hours later east. I didn't believe it. They couldn't be sailing into the English Channel. We would have to steam right past the English guns. But that was the order. Set sail for home via the English Channel. They kept it so secret, only the captains of the ships knew. They had actually fooled all the dock workers in the port by loading tropical helmets for all the crew onto the ships, and also loading barrels of oil which had on the side of them for tropical use only. So that as they were loaded on the ship, the workers in the dockyard were telling everybody in the bars and everything, which would eventually get through to the British agents and then back to London, that these ships were going to the South Atlantic. They weren't going somewhere else. And as you heard, they covered the compasses up, so even the crew didn't know where they were going until they were well out of Brest. The British plan was called Operation Fuller because we were obviously very well aware of the threat, and they were being attacked constantly, blockaded, and of course our code breakers were also breaking a lot of the naval codes by then, and they could predict what they were going to do next. And our radio listening stations too were listening for any traffic that made it obvious that there was going to be any movement. But as I said, the jamming of the radio signals had started 2 or 3 weeks before and gradually been increased. So basically, by 5:15 in the morning, they were still undetected. They were off Alderney, and they had so far not been contacted. They'd been at sea for 6 hours. Nobody had noticed they'd gone. As you heard, the stopper aircraft had a defect. The submarine hadn't told them. So they had managed to get out of Brest without anybody letting the Brits know, or the Brits finding out from their own reconnaissance. We always wondered why the Royal Navy did not attack us. Later on, after the war, I found out from some English books that one of their officers said that on this day, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And that's exactly what this story is all about. You can have some luck in military warfare and battles, and in this case, the Germans had all the luck going. The first radar reports started to come through at 9:15 in the morning, and all it was that coastal shipping has been seen escorted by aircraft. As soon as it was light, the aircraft were over the ships. They never had less than 9 aircraft protecting them, and they were rotating throughout the mission. The details that were given by the radar were ignored in the command chain all the way back up to London to the Admiralty. They were thought as being ordinary routine messages, and they were therefore filed in the sort of pending tray. The ships got as far as Dieppe. They were travelling quite quickly, but not as quick as they have ended up travelling. 20 knots, 23 miles an hour, which is pretty quick. We're doing about 8 at the moment in this ship. At 10:16, the radar reported 2 large surface vessels approaching Cape Grisnez, which is almost opposite Dover, and they're about to pass through the Dover-Calais gap. Now, when we had the captain's announcement today at noon, we were almost precisely at the right time and place that they were in 1942 on the 12th of December. The weather wasn't quite as good as it was today. The first visual sighting was done at 10:42 when 2 Spitfires took off from one of the airfields near the coast of Great Britain, and at 10:50 they flew over. The weather was quite low cloud, misty. They managed to see what they called a large convoy, but they took no action. They certainly didn't fly too low and get shot at, because they would have been silly to do that. But they took no action because they had been told absolutely no use of the radio. Radio silence was imperative. When they landed, 2 more Spitfires took off with these 2 characters in. I put them in because the chap on the right is a man called Victor Beamish, and he was the station commander or the base commander of RAF Hawkinge, and he had been a Battle of Britain station commander as well. He was extremely keen on flying and used to fly constantly with the squadrons that were under him on the base that he commanded. It wasn't really liked by the Air Ministry and by his bosses. They didn't like expending senior officers willy-nilly on combat missions, and they particularly didn't like senior officers getting captured by the enemy. So he was it was frowned upon. But he insisted, so in order to fly, the squadron commander of one of the squadrons had to fly with him. So every time he wanted to fly, poor old Wing Commander Boyd had to go up with him, and Beamish was a very gung-ho chap, so he wasn't going to be put off by any anti-aircraft fire from ships. So he took them both down so low that they did identify what it was. But again, because of radio silence, they had to wait until they landed. And they didn't land until nearly 10 past 11 on the 12th of December 1942, and they reported on landing that the Brest battle group was out. So look how long it's taken for the Brits to wake up. The ships have got all the way from Brest right opposite Dover before they've even been detected. And then all hell let loose. But disorganized hell was let loose, sadly. The shore batteries at the North Foreland, which is right above the White Cliffs of Dover, they had just been, new guns had just been installed with special, what they call K-type radar. Predictive radar, which would fire the guns. You wouldn't have to see the target. You'd look at a radar screen and you would fire the guns, basically computer controlled. Never been used before. Normally, in those days, the sort of guns that they operated, they would need somebody to observe what was called the fall of shot, where the rounds actually landed, so they could then adjust their aim. But the weather was so foggy, misty, low cloud, and so on, and the range was very great as well, that they didn't have the opportunity to see the fall of shot. They thought that the new radar was so sophisticated that it would actually pick up the fall of shot and they could adjust their guns accordingly. Well, none of their 33 rounds hit any of the German ships. Possibly because by the time they got to the narrowest bit, where we were at noon today, the 23 miles between Dover and Calais, they were very, very close to the French coast, so they were about 20 miles at least away. They were doing 30 knots. Now 30 knots is 35 miles an hour. That is fast for ships, and the German large capital ships were all capable of very fast speeds. And it's possible that the shore batteries were shooting behind them. They were shooting where they had been a couple of seconds before, and that was the reason that they didn't get them. But we did send out motor torpedo boats, and the flotilla of German ships was guarded by their equivalent E-boats, and there were small battles between our motor torpedo boats and the German E-boats. Very effective operations on both sides. We both had very good small, fast boats, but no conclusive battles where kills of ships or sinking of ships took place. But look at the weather. 7/10 cloud, 1,400 yards visibility horizontally, and a cloud base of 600 to 900 feet. That's a gift to the Kriegsmarine, because we had the cloud base today when we went through the straits. It was a bit misty. I looked out of our cabin, went out onto the balcony and had a good look round so I could say to you what I thought it was. I think you know I'm a pilot, so I'm supposed to be able to estimate weather. I thought at noon today we probably had about 1,500 yards of horizontal visibility, but about 1,500 feet of cloud. They had 600 to 900 feet. And it was probably 5 tenths, half cloud today. So they had the weather on their side as well. The heavy guns that were firing, as I say, they were situated on the above the White Cliffs of Dover. They had a very sophisticated underground plotting room and all sorts of things. But they signally failed. At 12:50, number 825 Squadron had a flight of 6 of these Swordfish bombers based at RAF Manston, which during the Battle of Britain was called Hellfire Corner because it was the nearest airfield to France. And it was always the place that you positioned aircraft if you wanted to get quickly over to France. So as part of Operation Fuller, the preparations for this sort of thing happening, the Germans trying to get through the Channel, we had based a flight of Swordfish torpedo biplanes at RAF Manston. And we arranged, or the plan was, Operation Fuller's plan was that they would be protected by 3 fighter squadrons of Spitfires. Unfortunately, lack of communication and a mix-up and all sorts of things going belly up, pear-shaped, or whatever you want to call it, only 1 squadron of Spitfires came, and the Swordfish still set off in order to attack this massively protected flotilla. Now, the Fairy Swordfish is something else. I mean, it's a fabric-covered biplane. It has a crew of 3, a pilot, an observer, navigator, and a radio operator gunner, and it does, at best, really flat out, 125 knots. And of course, it had been formidable in the 1930s, and it had contributed significantly to disabling the Bismarck and then allowing her to be sunk by our ships. But it was old and slow and so on. This is a photograph of the successful crew, one of the successful crews, after the Bismarck incident. And the person second from the left, that little chap with his arms folded, is the commander of this little flight of 6 aeroplanes. And with no protection whatsoever, they attacked these capital ships. And for doing that and getting killed in the process, they were all shot down, every single one of them. Eugene Esmond was awarded our country's highest award, equivalent to the Congressional Medal of Honor in the United States. The Victoria Cross is given to any person in the military, and it just says on it, "For valor." It's very simple, made out of the metal from the guns from the Crimean War. And a very simple ribbon. Whatever rank you are, if you have that ribbon, everybody salutes you. Everybody. So, unfortunately, in this case, that Victoria Cross was awarded posthumously. The English attacked us with their old Swordfish torpedo airplanes, but by then we had already passed Dover. You could say the English were caught napping, but of course our main task was to repulse attacking aircraft. I belonged to the heavy flak. We had divided the sky into grid squares and rained fire on them, and of course we shot them down like that.
Kurze Zeit später, zwischen 10 und Mittag, tauchte ein Torpedoflugzeug.
Between 10 a.m. and lunchtime, a torpedo squadron turned up. The slow Swordfish had to fly straight and steady before they could release the torpedoes. The first had to fly in the direction of the ship, and then it was one plane after another which flew towards us to attack. We shot them down as soon as they appeared. So it was a suicide mission, basically. A few of them survived in the water and were picked up, but they were nearly all killed. And no great damage was done to any of the ships. But it was both Admiral Ciliax, in charge of the German flotilla, and also the British admiral in charge, both said it was one of the most heroic actions they'd seen in the whole of their wartime careers. Nearly 2:15, still on December the 12th, the ships have got up to where we're going to be tomorrow. And then suddenly the Scharnhorst strikes a mine. One of these mines, but I rather like that photograph. When I was a child, these things were still on beaches all the way around the British Isles. And this is a British mine, which I think is what the Scharnhorst struck, but in actual fact, she might well have struck a German mine. But the interesting thing about being struck with the mine, she was carrying Admiral Ciliax. So she slowed down somewhat for the repairs to be undertaken. And they immediately, the Admiral has to be on the most speedy and efficient vessel. So immediately he was transferring to a destroyer, a German Kriegsmarine destroyer, Z-29, which was one of the escort ships. And the crew that were on Z-79, saw him coming in his admiral's barge and the Scharnhorst slowing down, and they got so excited that they raised the admiral's pennant on their ship before he even got to the ship. The Royal Air Force at that time had started to attack the flotilla, and immediately saw the pennant raising, they started to attack the destroyer. He only got on the ship for about 5 minutes, and they realized the Scharnhorst had been repaired. The engineers had managed to repair it in 20 minutes, and it started to overtake them again. So the admiral left, and they pulled the pennant down as quickly as they possibly could. The Royal Air Force attacks didn't start until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So they'd now been sailing for nearly 11 hours, and the first aircraft to attack them were at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And we sent 242 aircraft against them. And there's some pictures of the aircraft that we sent, and the yellow numbers on them relate to their names down the left-hand side. It's not really relevant to bother too much about what types of aircraft, but the thing to note is that of those 242 aircraft that were sent out over a period of time, only 39 found the flotilla, and of those 39, 15 were lost. Again, further north, by 5:15 in the evening, the Luftwaffe had been protecting them so well that there was very little damage to the aircraft. One mine had been, to the ships, one mine had been struck by Scharnhorst. Gneisenau now hits another mine. But the Luftwaffe's protection, you can see the arrows that are pointing. I know it's difficult to see the map, but it shows the features of the coast, and each of those arrows is an attack by an individual set of either destroyers, motor torpedo boats, or aeroplanes at particular points. But the 16 fighters that were permanently over the flotilla were extremely effective. 109s, Messerschmitt 109s. The Focke-Wulf 90, which you see at the top right then, was a brand new aeroplane, extremely effective. And then at night time, they had the twin engine aircraft. And then Scharnhorst at 9 o'clock at night strikes yet another mine. And that put her out of action for 3 months. So whilst they got to their destination, they didn't get there without any particular damage, and she steamed into Wilhelmshaven. But by then, by 9 o'clock on the 12th of December 1942, in these latitudes, it was dark. The weather had held bad, so they'd managed to get through. And the fleet was safe. And then Ciliax sends this message at 10 a.m. the next morning when they're all home, and it's my duty to inform you that Operation CERBERUS has been successfully completed. And they trumpeted their success.
And here, more footages of the breakthrough of our battleships through the English Channel. Even British voices consider it was being one of the biggest humiliations of the British naval force. The operation was a success. The North Sea has been reached, just like a British admiral commented. The joint operations of the German ships and airplanes was downright marvellous. The audacious coup de main of our Kriegsmarine gave the Brits such a shock that they temporarily forgot their recent loss of Singapore, and even a cabinet reshuffle happened as a consequence.
is all absolutely correct. There was a huge investigation, and as I said earlier, the lack of communication, the difficulties, the tactics used by the Germans of starting their evasion before evasion tactics, radio jamming, increasing radio traffic and all that sort of stuff, all of those were put into place by us before D-Day from the lessons that we'd learned from this. A number of heads rolled, as you would expect at senior levels, but this is the cost. The Luftwaffe air umbrella lost 17 fighters and 11 pilots. The British aircraft losses were 58 aircraft. One destroyer, HMS Worcester, suffered a large loss of life, 23 men killed, and 3 died of wounds the next day, and the ship was out of action for quite a long time. Those 3 great ships, having moved all the way to Germany, this is what happened to them. We'll start with the Gneisenau on the right. 2 weeks after getting to Kiel, on the night of February the 26th, 27th, the Royal Air Force got her. She never sailed again. She was used as a hulk, and her guns were removed and used as ground-based guns. The Scharnhorst went all the way up to northern Norway, and if ever any of you do a Viking cruise, and I'm lucky enough to be with you, I talk about the capital ships the Germans kept in the northern Norwegian fjords and our efforts to sink them up there. But eventually the Scharnhorst went out on a raid, and she was lured out by the Brits by a couple of convoys being sent right past her nose, but with 2 battle groups of the Royal Navy sitting in the wings just waiting for her to come out. She fought valiantly, but she actually was sunk on Boxing Day 1943 with a significant loss of life. And in that particular instance, the same sort of words that were said by the Germans and the Brits about Eugene Esmond and his attack in the Channel Dash were said by particularly the British Admiral about the German sailors and their fighting ability when Scharnhorst went down. The Prince Eugen might interest you because she was torpedoed a number of times, took part in operations in the Baltic, but was surrendered to the United States at the end of the war. She was sailed over to the United States with a skeleton German crew, and she was one of the ships that may well have joined the United States Navy, but she didn't. She was towed and moored near the epicenter of 2 nuclear bomb tests in the Pacific in order to test what would happen to ships after an atomic blast. The mood in Britain, the Times newspaper, the London Times newspaper, said Vice Admiral Ciliax has succeeded where the Duke of Medina Sidonia failed, the Spanish Armada. Nothing more mortifying in the pride of our sea power has happened since the 17th century. It spelled the end of the Royal Navy legend that in wartime no enemy battle fleet could pass through what we proudly call the English Channel. And we have memorials in Dover to the Operation Fuller side, the British side. And if you're ever lucky enough to go to the Labo Naval Memorial in Kiel, the propeller from Prince Eugen, slightly glowing in the dark, is positioned there. So this was an audacious plan conceived out of desperation, but executed with excellent planning. It was outwardly successful, they got where they wanted to go, but ultimately a demonstration of the impotence of the German surface fleet. The British were prepared but inflexible, and in spite of the bravery of individual sailors and airmen, heads rolled at the highest levels, questions were asked in Parliament, and the 3 armed services worked together more closely as a result. This lesson was implemented in future operations. So the Channel Dash, ladies and gentlemen, was why D-Day was such a success. Thank you very much. I'm about for questions all over the ship. I haven't jumped yet. The next talk I'm giving is about the Tirpitz, whose home port was Kiel for many years, and we'll be talking about that in a couple of days' time. Thank you.